A young couple stood in the courtroom, mocked by the judge and opposing lawyer. Everyone thought they were clueless. But no one knew the truth. Brian and Emily weren't just an ordinary couple. They were brilliant lawyers hiding in plain sight. The moment they presented their evidence, the entire courtroom shifted. Those who laughed at them fell silent. But this wasn't just about winning a legal case, because Derek Holloway, the ruthless CEO behind the fraud, wasn't the kind of man to lose quietly. When the threats turned into real danger and their lives were on the line, the fight moved beyond the courtroom, and the way it ended was something no one saw coming. Before we getting started, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, and comment. Where are you from watching? The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter, the kind that made your skin crawl. Judge Dawson leaned back in his chair, smirking as he watched Brian and Emily stand at the defendant's table. Honestly, he sighed dramatically, glancing at the opposing attorney. This is embarrassing. I almost feel bad letting you go against them. Stevenson, the seasoned lawyer for the opposing side, chuckled, shaking his head. They're young, Your Honor. They don't know any better. The audience snickered, a few whispering among themselves. A couple of law students in the back exchanged knowing looks, already expecting this to be a disaster. Brian remained still, his face unreadable. Emily, however, took a slow, measured breath, her gaze sharpening. She tightened her grip on Brian's hand before letting go and stepping forward. Her voice was firm, unwavering. Your Honor, she said, loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. Are you finished mocking us? Silence. The laughter died. The courtroom, which had been filled with smug amusement moments ago, now felt suffocatingly still. Judge Dawson blinked. His smirk faltered. What did you just say? He asked, his voice no longer amused. Emily took another step forward. I asked if you were finished, she repeated, her posture straight, her tone crisp. Stevenson sat up, his expression shifting from amused to cautious. Something had changed. Brian adjusted his sleeve and finally spoke, his voice calm, but edged with something sharp. Because if you are, we'd like to proceed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Dawson narrowed his eyes. The people in the audience, who had laughed at them moments ago, were no longer laughing. And this was only the beginning. Brian sat at the small kitchen table, rubbing his temples, his eyes locked on the crumpled eviction notice pinned to the fridge. Emily stood beside him, arms crossed, her jaw clenched. This can't be real, she muttered, shaking her head. We paid everything on time. We never broke a single lease rule. Brian exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. It's not about rules, Em. They don't care. They just want us out so they can jack up the rent. Emily grabbed the notice, scanning it again. The wording was so vague, so carefully crafted, like it had been designed to sound legal, even though it wasn't. They think we're just going to pack up and leave, she said, her voice quieter now. Just another couple who can't fight back. Brian watched her for a moment, then stood. He walked over to a folder on the counter and flipped through the pages, old lease agreements, payment receipts, official letters from the landlord. Every single one of them told the same story. They were being pushed out for no reason. Emily's eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. A decision. Most people didn't know the truth about them. They weren't just an ordinary young couple struggling to make ends meet. They were lawyers, trained, tested, and certified. They had passed the bar at 21, trained under some of the best legal minds in the country, and then stepped away from the traditional path. They had kept it quiet, never making a big deal about it. But now? Now, it was time to remind the world exactly who they were. Brian and Emily walked into the courtroom, their expressions neutral, their steps measured. To everyone else, they looked exactly as expected, young, inexperienced, and completely out of their depth. At the opposite table, Stevenson leaned over to his assistant, smirking. "This will be over before lunch," he muttered, adjusting his tie with unnecessary confidence. Judge Dawson barely glanced at Brian and Emily as he settled into his seat. He exhaled, already bored, then turned his attention to Stevenson. "Go ahead, counselor. Let's get this over with." Brian and Emily remained silent as Stevenson launched into his argument. He spoke with practiced ease, throwing around legal jargon, his voice dripping with arrogance. Every word he said painted them as naive tenants who had no idea how the legal system worked. Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Brian leaned back slightly, his expression one of quiet observation. They didn't interrupt. They didn't object. They just listened. The silence stretched, and for a moment even the judge seemed puzzled. His gaze flicked between them, noting the way they held themselves, too calm, too controlled. Still, he chuckled under his breath. "Do you two even know how a courtroom works?" Laughter rippled through the audience. Stevenson smirked, enjoying the judge's amusement. He turned to Brian and Emily, expecting them to look embarrassed, to fumble through a weak defense, but they didn't. Emily simply tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Brian barely moved. They let the moment sit, let everyone in the room settle into their belief that this was going to be an easy case. They were setting the trap, and no one, not even Judge Dawson, saw it coming. Emily stood up slowly, her fingers tightening around a document as she stepped toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Before we continue, I'd like to present this." Stevenson barely looked up from his notes, scoffing. "Oh, please. What could they possibly have?" She ignored him, setting the paper down in front of Judge Dawson. "This is our original lease agreement, filed with city records, the one the opposing party conveniently altered." Silence filled the room. The judge furrowed his brow and adjusted his glasses, picking up the document. His eyes scanned it, and his once bored expression began to shift, first to confusion, then to something darker. Stevenson's smirk wavered. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous." Emily cut him off, her voice sharper now. "No. What's ridiculous is that my signature has been forged on the lease your client submitted. The dates don't match. The terms have been altered. And if you check, you'll see the stamp isn't even official." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Dawson's grip on the paper tightened. His gaze lifted to Stevenson, his previously amused demeanor replaced with scrutiny. Stevenson straightened, suddenly uncomfortable. "This is a misunderstanding." Brian leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Then you won't mind if we verify its authenticity." The color drained from Stevenson's face. The judge exhaled sharply, then turned to the clerk. "Summon an expert for verification, now." The atmosphere in the room shifted. What had been a casual dismissal of two inexperienced tenants was now turning into something far more serious. Emily and Brian exchanged a brief glance. They had just flipped the entire case upside down. Brian stood, his voice steady, but edged with something sharp. "Your Honor, this isn't just about us." Emily placed another folder on the judge's desk, her fingers brushing against the cover before stepping back. "We've found at least 10 other cases. Tenants forced out under suspicious circumstances, all under Holloway Properties." The room tensed. A few gasps escaped from the audience. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting. Stevenson's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. "Your Honor, this is outrageous! These claims are baseless." Brian turned, his expression unreadable. "Are they?" Judge Dawson flipped open the folder, scanning its contents. His face darkened. Emily continued, her voice unwavering. Forgery, false violations, altered leases. The patterns are identical. If you compare our case to the others, you'll find one undeniable truth. She took a breath, then delivered the blow. Holloway Properties has built an entire business model on fraud. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of someone knocking over a chair in shock. Stevenson swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. This is absurd. These are isolated cases. Brian's lips twitched. Then you won't mind if we investigate. Judge Dawson let out a long breath, rubbing his temple. His gaze flicked between the couple, then to Stevenson, then back to the files in front of him. He picked up the gavel, but instead of striking it, he held it firm. We're ordering a full forensic analysis on every eviction filed under Holloway Properties in the last 5 years. Stevenson staggered back like the air had been knocked out of him. The courtroom's energy had shifted completely. Brian and Emily weren't just tenants anymore. They were the ones leading the case. Brian scrolled through the files, his jaw tightening with every line he read. Emily leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the emails on the screen. "This is it," she whispered. "Proof." The emails were damning. Messages between executives at Holloway Properties, casually discussing eviction quotas, fabricated lease violations, and methods to keep tenants from fighting back. Brian clicked on one, reading aloud. If they contest, delay the court dates. Most of them give up before it even reaches trial. If they don't, well, we have ways to handle that. Emily swallowed hard. They planned this. They knew exactly what they were doing. A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Brian exchanged a look with Emily before standing. He moved cautiously, glancing through the peephole. A thick envelope had been slid under the door. No one was outside. Emily bent down, picking it up with hesitant fingers. She peeled it open, and as she pulled out the contents, her breath hitched. Photos of them. Brian in the courthouse, Emily walking home, both of them sitting in this very apartment, and a single note. Walk away. Or we make you. Brian clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. They're not just fighting in the courtroom anymore. Emily's eyes flicked to the shattered glass near the window, cracks spider-webbed across the pane from a rock someone had thrown earlier that night. Her voice was quiet but resolute. Then neither are we. Every head turned as Rebecca Holloway strode in, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The sharp suit, the unwavering gaze, she commanded attention. Stevenson's smirk faltered. Judge Dawson raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" Rebecca met his gaze without hesitation. "Rebecca Holloway, I'm here to testify." The murmurs grew louder. A Holloway testifying against Holloway Properties. Stevenson shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we object." Judge Dawson held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Stevenson." Rebecca stepped forward, placing a thick folder onto the judge's desk. Inside this folder are financial records, internal memos, and email chains detailing years of fraud. Brian and Emily exchanged a glance. This was bigger than they had hoped for. Judge Dawson flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. He looked up sharply. Bribes, fake violations, forced evictions? Rebecca nodded. My father built his empire by manipulating the system. If tenants couldn't be scared away, they were priced out. If that didn't work, documents were forged, and judges were bought. A hush fell over the courtroom. Stevenson stood, his face tight. Your Honor, this witness... Rebecca cut him off. Oh, and there's one more thing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive, holding it up. This contains recorded conversations between my father, Mr. Stevenson, and several executives discussing how to bypass regulations and silence legal challenges. Stevenson went rigid. Judge Dawson exhaled sharply, motioning to the bailiff. Play it. The courtroom held its breath as the audio crackled to life. Stevenson's own voice rang through the speakers. We'll delay proceedings, file counterclaims, drag it out. They'll run out of money before we lose a case. If they don't, we'll handle it another way. Then came another voice, Derek Holloway himself. If the court won't rule in our favor, we'll make sure the judge knows where his paycheck comes from. Gasps erupted across the room. Judge Dawson's expression turned cold as he looked up. Mr. Stevenson, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and aiding in illegal evictions. Two officers stepped forward, grabbing Stevenson's arms, his face twisted in fury. This isn't over, he spat as they led him away. Brian leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Emily crossed her arms. Rebecca gave them both a knowing look. That's one down. But they all knew the real fight was still ahead. Brian's grip tightened on the steering wheel as Emily scrolled through her phone. The news was everywhere. Stevenson's arrest, Rebecca's testimony, the collapse of Holloway Properties. But victory didn't feel safe. Not yet. Emily's phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Her stomach dropped. Brian glanced at her. What is it? Wordlessly, she turned the screen toward him. His jaw clenched. A second later, his own phone lit up. Unknown number. A call. Emily shook her head. Don't answer. Brian ignored her and picked up. A slow, amused chuckle came through the speaker. Carter? Brian's fingers curled around the wheel. Holloway? You think this is over? The voice was calm, controlled. You think you can take down my company, humiliate me in court, and walk away? Brian didn't blink. Looks like we already have. A pause. Then a dark chuckle. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The line went dead. Emily's pulse raced. That wasn't just a threat. Brian exhaled sharply. Number it was a promise. They weren't safe. Hours later, deep in the woods at the safe house, the night was unnervingly quiet. No sirens, no city noise, just the rustling of trees in the wind. Emily sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself. Maybe we should... A sudden noise outside, a branch snapping. Brian was on his feet in an instant. Did you hear that? Another sound. Footsteps. Then, bang! The window shattered. Emily screamed as Brian grabbed her arm, pulling her down. Shadows moved outside, a figure in the darkness. Then a voice. Holloway's voice. You should have taken the easy way out. Brian reached for the gun Detective Hayes had given them. We need to move. Emily's heart pounded. How did he find us? Another crash. The front door rattled as something heavy slammed into it. Emily grabbed her phone, fingers shaking as she dialed. Hayes, he's here. I know. Hayes's voice was tight. Stay low, I'm en route, 5 minutes. We don't have 5 minutes. The door burst open. 2 men, black suits, guns drawn. Brian aimed, but before he could fire, bang! A shot rang out. Not from him, from the woods. The man in front staggered and collapsed. Then headlights flooded the clearing as a black SUV skidded into the driveway. Detective Hayes jumped out, gun raised. Drop your weapons! The second attacker hesitated, then bolted. Brian exhaled sharply, lowering his gun. Emily clutched his arm, shaking. Hayes stepped over the unconscious man, eyes cold. That was a warning. Brian looked at the body. And if we don't listen? Hayes met his gaze. Then next time, they won't miss. Emily's hands trembled as she reloaded her gun. Brian stood by the door, heart hammering in his chest. They had spent weeks running, hiding, fighting back. But this time, Holloway had found them. A low knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Brian's grip tightened. Then Holloway's voice. Smooth, confident, dangerous. "Come on now. No need to make this messy." Emily's breath hitched. Brian took a slow step forward, gun raised. "Walk away, Holloway." A dark chuckle. "You still don't get it, do you?" Another knock, harder this time. "I don't walk away." Silence stretched, then crack. The door exploded inward. Holloway stepped inside, a pistol in his hand, his suit pristine despite the storm raging outside. His sharp blue eyes gleamed with amusement. "You really thought you could take me down?" he mused, tilting his head. Brian didn't hesitate. He raised his gun. Bang! A shot fired. Emily gasped, but Brian wasn't hit. The bullet had missed. Holloway's smirk widened as he took slow steps forward. "Shame. You're good in court, Carter. But out here, you're just another scared kid with a gun?" Brian's jaw clenched. "You're done, Holloway. The company's gone. Your empire is dust." Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Empires can be rebuilt." His finger tightened on the trigger. Emily's breath caught. "Brian!" Bang! Holloway jerked back, a stunned expression frozen on his face. A red stain spread across his chest. Behind him, standing in the doorway, gun still raised, Detective Hayes. Holloway staggered, struggling for breath. He tried to speak, but the words never came. His legs buckled, and he crumpled to the floor. Dead. A suffocating silence filled the cabin. Brian exhaled, his hands still shaking. Emily let out a choked breath. Hayes lowered his gun, stepping forward. "Took me a while to track you down." His gaze flickered to Holloway's lifeless body. "Didn't think I'd have to shoot him." Brian swallowed hard. "Is it over?" Hayes sighed, nodding. "Yeah, it's over." Emily pressed a hand to her chest, inhaling shakily. No more running, no more threats. Holloway was gone. His empire, dismantled. They had won. For the first time in months, they were free. Judge Dawson clears his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looks down at the final ruling in his hands. His voice, firm and unwavering, echoes through the courtroom. The court finds Holloway Properties guilty of widespread fraud, falsified evictions, and obstruction of justice. Gasps ripple through the audience. All fraudulent evictions are hereby overturned. All assets belonging to Holloway Properties will be seized and redistributed to those affected. Stevenson, pale and shaking, lowers his head in defeat. It's over. Brian exhales, gripping Emily's hand under the table. They did it. Judge Dawson turns to them, a rare smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Mr. Carter, Miss Reynolds, you've proven yourselves more than capable in a courtroom." Emily straightens, feeling the weight of the moment. Dawson leans forward. "So, tell me, are you considering making this official?" Brian glances at Emily, a knowing smile passing between them. "We're thinking about it," she says. Dawson chuckles. "I'd say you already started." The gavel slams. Case closed. Inside, Brian leans against the doorway, coffee in hand, watching Emily adjust a file on her desk. "First client just walked in." He smirks. Emily grins. "Let's win another case." Brian chuckles, shaking his head. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were delivering it. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine the real battles people fight every day for justice. Don't let the truth stay hidden. Hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life.